This video is brought to you by Audible. Go to audible.com/polyphonic or text polyphonic to 500 to get 60% off your first 3 months. These days, Led Zeppelin are ubiquitous. Their songs will be a staple of any classic rock radio station. You'll hear them in movies and commercials. You'll see t-shirts on all sorts of merch shelves. But when Zeppelin were at their peak, that wasn't the case. Where other 70s bands had regular TV appearances and singles topping the charts, Zeppelin had an air of mystique around them. And that's because of the marketing strategy of the band's manager, Peter Grant. Grant only let the band release a handful of singles, so that music fans needed to buy the albums if they wanted to hear Zeppelin. And after their first 3 releases, Zeppelin's albums themselves took on an air of mystery thanks to the art of hypnosis, surrealist pieces with the band's name nowhere in sight. To add to this mystique, Grant didn't let Zeppelin make television appearances. While on tour, he would even hole Zeppelin up in hotel rooms to keep them away from the eyes of their mobs of fans. So, at the height of Led Zeppelin's fame, the only way to truly see the band was to go to a live concert. Grant's strategy paid dividends. People would sleep outside the stadium waiting for Zeppelin tickets, and the band's elaborate live show became the stuff of legend. As the myth of Zeppelin grew, their music changed to lean into it. They kept the blues in their repertoire, but added epic songs laced with references to the mythological and to the occult. Strange rumors about Led Zeppelin began to leak out, and the band started to transcend their lived existence, becoming figureheads of a modern myth and embodiments of a new cultural archetype, the rock god. Let's take a closer look. In any given human society, there are folk heroes. People whose stories grow larger than their reality, and in doing so become enshrined in their culture's history. People like Robin Hood, Butch Cassidy, Big Joe Mufferaw, or Robert Johnson. I think that, in a sense, Peter Grant's publicity strategy, along with Zeppelin's songwriting, helped develop them into a modern version of these folk heroes. Zeppelin were living in a world where many of the cultural institutions of the past were being called into question. The power of religious stories was fading with the rise of secularism, and narratives about war, which had once been a cornerstone of folk heroism, were being thrown into question after Vietnam. But still, people wanted heroes. They wanted people they could look up to show them how to create meaning in their own life, how to better exist as a person, and how to face the fears and pains of the human condition. So they turned to the arts. And on this front, Led Zeppelin were more than happy to oblige. The band members themselves had always had a fascination with mythical imagery, whether it was Jimmy Page's occultism or Robert Plant's love of Tolkien. This fascination showed itself early in their music through songs like Ramble On, which pulls from the works of Tolkien, or the Immigrant Song, which compares their experiences playing a show in Reykjavik to Norse myth. These songs helped launch Zeppelin into fame, and so they started to lean further into this mythological imagery. On their 4th album, Led Zeppelin sung about epic struggles between good and evil on Battle of Evermore. Going to California dreams of escaping to a utopian paradise, and depicts a romanticized version of Joni Mitchell as a sort of fairy queen. And then of course there's Stairway to Heaven. That song has always seemed to me to be a sort of interpretation of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, using vague poetic imagery to describe an incredible adventure and personal growth. The smash success of Led Zeppelin 4 helped to elevate Zeppelin's mythological status. They began selling out shows to thousands of people, their concerts turning into near spiritual experiences for their most die-hard fans. And the story grew. On their next album, Zeppelin abandoned their simple album titles for something more symbolic, Houses of the Holy. In one of the more infuriating release decisions in music history, the song Houses of the Holy wasn't actually released until their next album, Physical Graffiti. But in the lyrics of that song, we can see the meaning of Zeppelin's fifth album title. The Houses of the Holy refer to the stadiums that Zeppelin played their music in, and the holy air about them when the band performed. The song rings like a sort of pagan rite, Plant singing about seduction while praising the mystical power of music. A lot of what Zeppelin were working on at this time had to do with the mythical powers of music. The album Houses of the Holy opens with The Song Remains the Same, one of my personal favorite pieces in their entire catalog. The lyrics of that song are sparse and simple, but they tell an inspiring message. As Zeppelin were touring the world, flying around on their starship, there was one constant that kept them anchored to their humanity: the music they played. Whether in California, Calcutta, or Honolulu, the song remained the same. Music itself was Zeppelin's virtue. Their love and understanding of its power to touch the soul was what raised them into this mythical status of folk hero. And as they continued to tour, they extended this metaphor. Physical Graffiti has songs like The Rover and Kashmir, which compare their constant touring life to the stories of legendary heroes going on adventures to far-off lands. This comparison becomes even more direct on Achilles' Last Stand, the epic opening track to 1976's Presence. That song was inspired by a trip that Robert Plant took through the Mediterranean after breaking his ankle in a car accident. In it, he is explicitly comparing himself to the folk hero Achilles. Now, this shouldn't exactly be a surprise. One of the great folk tales about Robert Plant has him standing on the balcony of Los Angeles' Hyatt House Hotel, shouting, "I am a golden god," out over the city below. And as far as Zeppelin's exploits go, that one is pretty tame. As Zeppelin were developing their own mythology through their music, their fans were growing that myth by spreading stories through word of mouth. Stories of legendary parties and trashed hotel rooms. Stories of sleeping with groupies and doing prodigious amounts of drugs. Stories that embodied the phrase sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And stories that gave rise to the term rock god. But of course, Zeppelin weren't gods. No matter how fantastic the music they made, and no matter the heights they reached, Led Zeppelin were simply men. And deeply flawed men at that. I want to give a content warning here. This next section is going to talk about sexual abuse, addiction, and mental illness. Over the years, stories of Zeppelin's sexual exploits have turned into a foundational piece of the rock star myth. Along with contemporaries like The Who, David Bowie, and Alice Cooper, they set the groundwork for a lifestyle that would go on to dominate 80s rock with bands like Motley Crue. In this lifestyle, the women Zeppelin slept with were either celebrated as conquests or written off as fame-chasing groupies. In reality, many of these so-called groupies were victims. Zeppelin and their contemporaries would spend a lot of their time with teenage girls. Many of these so-called baby groupies became a part of Los Angeles' Sunset Strip music scene at a shockingly young age, developing their own sort of following around them and getting positive press in music publications like Cream. There was even a short-lived magazine called Star that dedicated itself to chronicling the lives of these groupies and giving tips to young girls that would want to take on the lifestyle. Some of the most famous of these groupies include Sable Starr, who allegedly got her start in the scene at just 11 years old. And then, of course, there's Laurie Maddox. Maddox was a baby groupie at the time of Zeppelin's peak and has been open about her experiences since. In a piece for Thrillist, Maddox describes losing her virginity to David Bowie at the age of 14. "I was an innocent girl, but the way it happened was so beautiful. I remember him looking like a god and having me over a table. Who wouldn't want to lose their virginity to David Bowie?" It's worth noting that others from the time have disputed Maddox's timelines with Bowie, but her extended relationship with Jimmy Page is clearly documented. While Zeppelin were on their 1972 North American tour, the 14-year-old Maddox had an extended relationship with Jimmy Page. Maddox didn't travel with the band because Page was afraid of getting arrested for statutory rape, but Page was incredibly controlling and wanted Maddox all to himself. So he kept her locked up in a hotel room in Los Angeles, flying back to visit her between tour dates. Their relationship lasted until Maddox was 16 and caught Page with another young groupie, Bebe Buell. Today, Maddox's perspective on these events is mixed. She's admitted that the Me Too movement helped her recontextualize her own experiences. In a 2015 interview with The Guardian, she gave a conflicted account, saying that Page treated her well and looking back on the time fondly, but adding, "I don't think underage girls should sleep with guys. I wouldn't want this for anybody's daughter." And regardless of how much Maddox might have wanted Page as a teenager, there could have never been consent in that relationship. Roxana Shirazi, herself a former groupie, explains this in her book, The Last Living Slut. It is never possible to have full agency. From the outset, the power structure is not equal. They're famous, and unless you're famous yourself, you're not on the same plane. It's fundamentally impossible for a teenager to have a healthy sexual relationship with somebody that they view as a literal living god. And this is where the mythologizing of Led Zeppelin takes its dark turn. When people view the band as gods, they're not going to hold them accountable in the same way. The Laurie Maddox case is probably the most reprehensible of Zeppelin's behaviors, but their track record toward women on the whole is pretty appalling. They would harass female journalists, including an incident where their tour manager Richard Cole pulled a gun on the journalist Lisa Robinson aboard the Starship. There's another story where the band allegedly tried to tear the clothes off of Ellen Sander, a reporter for Life magazine. And then of course there's the infamous Mudshark incident. That bit of misogyny has been written about enough, and I don't really care to retell it here, but if you want to find the story, I'm sure you can. Suffice to say that it was a moment of what I consider to be pretty reprehensible behavior. But all too often, these things aren't framed that way when we tell the Zeppelin myth. The Mudshark story is often told as a joke, as another chapter among Zeppelin's many wild exploits. I can't say for sure what actually happened in these stories, but if there's an iota of truth to them, they read less like a fun adventure and more like stories of rich, famous men exploiting and assaulting women who loved their art deeply. Seeing as a lot of this is speculation, it's hard to know exactly how much falls on each individual band member. Robert Plant told Vanity Fair that most of the stories were actually their road crew making a mess and covering it with their name. But there's also photographic evidence of Robert Plant hanging out with teenage girls on the Sunset Strip. And there are some things we know for sure. We know that Jimmy Page had an extended relationship with a minor, and we know that his bandmates seemingly did nothing to stop that. We also know the stories of John Bonham, a man with a harrowing alcohol addiction. So much so that he became known as the Beast when he drank, because of the way he would go into blind rages, seemingly at the drop of a hat. And we know that to this day, Zeppelin haven't really seemed to publicly show any sense of remorse or regret over the people they harmed. So what do we do with all of this? I think the temptation is to say, separate the art from the artist and leave it at that. Chances are some of you in the comments are already saying this, and maybe some of the time that alone is enough. But what do you do when the artist's lifestyle is so directly present in the art, and when the art so directly enables the artist's lifestyle? So much of Zeppelin's music is overtly about sex. The song Sick Again is even about Laurie Maddox specifically and mentions her age in the lyrics. Zeppelin's music created a narrative that they are sexual idols and rock gods, and that narrative enabled toxic behavior. And that legacy runs beyond the band themselves and onto the next generation of musicians. Now, like with our previous discussions, Zeppelin aren't entirely to blame here. Zeppelin were part of a broader culture that celebrated this behavior. And a lot of Zeppelin's exploits came down to the fact that Peter Grant drove them to very harsh working conditions. They were locked in hotel rooms and fed drugs and alcohol constantly. John Bonham was a deeply anxious person who was always homesick and deathly afraid of flying. His lifestyle fed into his addiction to alcohol and eventually brought about his death at just 32 years old. So there are tragic aspects to Zeppelin, and in a lot of ways they were trapped by circumstance. But unlike our conversations about art theft and cultural appropriation, I don't think that those circumstances give Zeppelin any sort of pass on this behavior. The reality is that Led Zeppelin broadly, and Jimmy Page specifically, abused their power. They either committed or enabled sexual assault on minors, and they were celebrated for it. This needs to be part of the legacy of Led Zeppelin. Personally, this is something that I, as a music creator, have to grapple with as well. Zeppelin are a part of the reason why I started this channel, and the main reason it blew up. I've made a lot of my livelihood on celebrating Zeppelin without applying a critical lens to their legacy. And it's not because I didn't know about this stuff. It's because, like so many before me, I chose to ignore these facts when it was convenient to me. But the victims of the ongoing culture of abuse in which we live don't just get to ignore these things. There are no doubt countless victims of abuse who know Zeppelin's legacy and see Zeppelin being celebrated as gods every day. I can't imagine how that must feel. So how do we proceed from here? How do we reconcile the twin legacies of Led Zeppelin, that of the innovative artists who inspired millions, and that of the abusers who got famous from the exploitation of oppressed minorities? To be honest, I don't know. I was hoping I might have some better idea of how to deal with some of this stuff by the end of this series, but I just don't. Whether it's Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, Michael Jackson, or any of these artists with complicated legacies, I don't think the answer can be just to not listen to the music. Because I honestly believe that the music of these artists has helped me be a better person. It's helped me understand what it means to be human, and helped me strive to love the beauty in life. That's going to be true regardless of who the band were as people. In that sense, at least, I guess there is a separation between art and artist in my mind, and I really can't help that. I'm sure that there's people out there that don't listen to Led Zeppelin because of this, and frankly, I think that's admirable. But when art hits you, it hits you, and there's not much you can do about it. Yet the shadow of abuse is inescapable. To celebrate these artists blindly and without question is to play into that legacy. The best approach that I can think of is to hold artists accountable to what their art has inspired in you. One of the reasons why I love Led Zeppelin's music is the way it depicts images of beauty, images of hope. Robert Plant's lyrics have always sung of good over evil, of the triumph of empathy and art. So let's try to reach a world that fits the standards set artistically in a song like Battle of Evermore or Going to California. I don't think this means that you need to have these conversations every time you put on a Zeppelin record, but I do think it means we need to remain cognizant of these things. We need to be willing to push back and challenge the artists we love. We need to understand how their lives inform their work, and we need to see them as people, not as gods. And doing so means being willing to open up to these sorts of uncomfortable, complicated, and difficult dialogues. Maybe most importantly, it means taking a look at how our histories are told and trying to shed new light on that. Trying to understand the perspective of these events, not just from the rich and powerful, but from all those who their fame impacted. Is that a satisfactory answer to all of these questions? I don't think so, but at least for now, it's the best that I've got. I want to thank everyone who has made it through this series. I'm really happy with the work that I've done on it, but honestly, there's always more to talk about with Led Zeppelin. One aspect of the story that I was only able to touch upon briefly in this video was Peter Grant. Grant was a brilliant, visionary manager who can honestly take a lot of the credit for Zeppelin's success. But like the band he managed, he was also deeply flawed and often dangerous. If you want to learn more about Peter Grant, you should check out Bring It On Home, Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin and Beyond, the story of rock's greatest manager on Audible. If that sounds up your alley, you should head over to audible.com/polyphonic or text polyphonic to 500-500. By doing so, you can save 60% on your first 3 months. That comes down to less than $6 a month. And for that, you'll get 1 free credit every month, good for any title in their selection. And you'll also get full access to the Audible Plus catalog, which includes podcasts, guided fitness, meditation, and all sorts of other goodies. I personally love audiobooks and will often even listen to them as I'm editing my videos. They're a great way to knock a few titles off that ever-growing to-read list. So again, if you want to give it a shot, go to audible.com/polyphonic or text polyphonic to 500-500. And thank you all so much for watching.